You are listening to Leaders and Legends, a podcast produced by Veteran Strategies and featuring conversations with fascinating and impactful men and women who have shaped our world, our communities, and our history. My name is Robert Vane, Principal of Veteran Strategies, and your host for our discussion. You are listening to Leaders and Legends, a podcast presented by Veteran Strategies, an Indiana-based public relations enterprise, and sponsored by Girl Scouts of Central Indiana, Garmong Construction, Leaders and Legends LLC, the Grand Hall and Conference Center at Historic Union Station, the McGinley's Golden Ace Inn, and NFP, a national insurance broker with strong local content. Our podcast is featured on the All Indiana Podcast Network in partnership with Wish TV. You may find Leaders and Legends at allindianapodcastnetwork.com. Thinking of starting a podcast or need to host a public meeting? Let Leaders and Legends LLC be your partner as you look for new ways to communicate your message. Please contact Chris Spangle or me at leadersandlegends.net. And as always, all our podcast interviews are dedicated to the legacy and generosity of P.E. McAllister. Thank you for joining us on the Leaders and Legends podcast. Our guest today is James Conroy, a best-selling historian. I've actually read 3 of his books now. They are all wonderful. James is the author of The Devils Will Get No Rest, FDR, Churchill, and the Plan That Won the War. Mr. Conroy, thank you so much for coming on the Leaders and Legends podcast.
Oh, it's my great pleasure. I appreciate being here.
Well, we were talking before we started about you being a generalist, but for World War II, you definitely filled in a significant gap with regard to war planning structure, not only the interdependence, but the interpersonal relationships among all the attendees at the Casablanca Conference. Before we get started, just questions about the conference itself. Why did you choose this particular event to chronicle?
Well, 2 reasons, really. One, I've written 4 books, and all 4 have been deliberately chosen because no other book had been written on the subject. And it's difficult to find such things that are interesting and haven't been beaten to death. And no book had been written about the Casablanca Conference, no full-length book. And secondly, I just happened to be watching a History Channel documentary years ago, and on the Casablanca Conference. Mm-hmm. And it occurred to me at the time that having FDR, Churchill, de Gaulle, Eisenhower, Patton, George C. Marshall, Lord Louis Mountbatten, and half a dozen other huge personalities in one place for 10 days, surrounded by barbed wire in a war zone, has got to be an interesting story. So that's where I went with it.
I'm going to ask you, I have written down to ask you about specific characters, but the conference system, did it replace the Congress system that was implemented in Europe after the defeat of Napoleon? In other words, did the conference mindset get influenced by what had happened previous, Washington Naval Treaty and all these sorts of things where, hey, we can come together and work together to make our plan come to fruition?
I think I don't think so. I think it was really an organic development, if you will, because immediately after Pearl Harbor, the first thing Churchill did was get on a battleship and bring his high command to Washington to make sure that that alliance was nailed down and to try to influence it as best he could. And I believe, I could be wrong, but I think that what we would today call a summit conference was a rarity at best in those days. And there were a half a dozen or more such summit conferences during the war among the Anglo-American allies. And this Churchill called this the most important of them all. So I think it was kind of sui generis. It just came out of the situation that they were in.
The Casablanca Conference occurs in January of 1943.
Correct.
Please tell the Leaders and Legends audience what's going on in the war, in World War II, while this conference is happening, the overall broader scope, because there are some significant conflicts and battles that are happening while these leaders are meeting.
Sure. Well, first of all, it was just over 3 years into the war from the British point of view, and a year and 2 months from the American point of view into the war. And it had been nothing but defeat for the Allies, with the sole exception of the Battle of Britain, which was a defensive battle. They held off the Germans from invading Britain barely. And beyond that, they had just suffered defeat after defeat. In the Pacific, the Americans had won the Battle of Coral Sea and the Battle of Midway, which turned the tide, against Japan in the spring of 1942. But in Europe, the Germans had just dominated. And what had occurred just before the Casablanca Conference in the fall of 1942 was the successful taking of North Africa by the Allies from the French, counterintuitively enough. And that was linked with Montgomery's defeat of Rommel at El Alamein in Egypt. Was actually part of the same operation. Montgomery pushed Rommel west from Egypt, and the Americans and the Brits landed in Morocco and Algeria with the object of catching him in a vice between the two of them, and also controlling North Africa, from which to take the next step. And the conference was held. Well, I should also say too that the tremendous Battle of Stalingrad was raging while the conference was held. And when the Russians won that battle, the tide really had turned in the European theater. And the basic purpose of the conference, the Casablanca Conference, was for Churchill and FDR and their combined high command to figure out what's next. How are we going to go on the offensive, and where are we going to go, and how are we going to do it? So it was essentially the turning point of the war from defense to offense on the Allied side.
And how did the relationship between, leaving the Soviet Union out of it for a bit, the relationship between Great Britain and the United States change because of this conference?
Well, that's a very interesting point, and I think it's kind of a theme that runs through the book. There was a lot of tension between the British and the Americans at this point. Mutual distrust, mutual suspicion, culture clash. We lose sight of the fact that in the 1940s, without TV, without the internet, without much of by way of radio even between the continents, they were much more separate cultures and really civilizations almost than they are today, with very different attitudes. The British were an empire and very imperially minded. The Americans were not to any great extent, and had a very different worldview. And when they came together in a series of conferences before the Casablanca Conference, they got to know each other. The connections and the ties had begun to form, but so had deep, serious disagreements about how to conduct the war and what was more important than something else. And this really gave them 10 days together in a resort hotel that the Americans had commandeered and surrounded with a mile of barbed wire. And they really had to live together, eat together, go to the bar together. There was no home court. It was neither in London nor in Washington. And so people couldn't go back to their offices or back to their hotel. And they were thrown together for 10 days. And that really made a big difference.
Prior to, when you read books about World War II and the Americans' entry into it, clearly Churchill and the Brits were thrilled, for lack of a better term. Like,
oh, yeah.
What's Churchill say? I slept the sleep of the saved, or something like that.
Exactly. Right.
But there was, in all that I've read, a significant amount of mild bitterness, and maybe those words can be changed, on the part of the Brits, basically like, where the hell have you been? We've been fighting by ourselves for a year. Now we got Stalin on our side. You don't come into the war until December of 41, and you were pushed into it by the Japanese. How did that, is that a fair assessment on behalf of the British Army and government and people? And how did they get past it to create war?
That's a perceptive comment. I think that is true. The Americans were keeping the Brits going, really, with Lend-Lease, giving them arms and ships and weapons, and to an increasing degree, taking on some of the naval responsibilities in the Atlantic to keep that route open, which was a difficult job with the U-boat infested waters there. So there's no doubt that, I don't think there's any doubt that the Brits could not have hung on as long as they did without that help from the Americans, and they appreciated it and they knew it. But nonetheless, they were the ones out there dying and fighting, and with their country on an eyelash of survival. And I think there probably was some resentment and some sort of where have you been, as you put it.
Whose idea was it to have the conference, not at Casablanca, the location you've already articulated, but just the idea that, hey, we need to get together at the highest level?
Yeah, it was essentially FDR's idea. FDR raised the idea with Churchill, who immediately welcomed it. They were friends as well as rivals in a way. They had met several times before in the course of the war, both before and after the Americans came in. But Churchill immediately signed on for that. They tried to get Stalin to come initially too, but Stalin was had his hands full with Stalingrad and was in no place to come.
One of the leaps out really on your pages, but other books as well, that Roosevelt and Churchill needed each other. And they clearly warmed to each other. Mm-hmm. But is it fair to say they never completely trusted each other? In other words, the United States was always looking for an advantage. And then, the United States thinking, well, this broken down empire is always looking for an advantage. Is that fair?
I think that's fair. George Marshall said, actually, after the war, that the Americans were always suspicious of the British and kind of looking for signs that they were double dealing them or leading them on or not being straight with them. And Marshall says that the British didn't feel that way about us because they didn't think we were smart enough or knew enough to be treacherous. Which I thought was a great line. But there was a good deal of unease and not complete trust between the two of them. Some to more, among some of them more than others, certainly. Mm-hmm. But interestingly enough, Marshall was, I think, at least neutral about British culture and friendships, if not favorable. But Admiral King, the chief of naval operations, despised the British and always had for many decades, thought of them as a potential enemy, thought there could be a war with Britain over commerce and naval issues. And the second tier of the American leadership were Anglophobic. I mean, really beyond mistrustful. They did not like the Brits. And I think Marshall put it best as far as the other side went, that the Brits kind of didn't think it highly enough of us to be as suspicious of us as we were of them.
And that goes back obviously to the Revolution, to 1812, War of 1812, and the Great War, which the United States stayed out of until April of 1917. April 6th, I think, is the declaration. A lot of the folks at the conference had fought in World War I, or had served one way or the other.
Yeah, they had all served, and some of them had fought. Yeah.
Did that do anything to help create a spirit of camaraderie? Is the fact that they had all shed blood before, metaphorically?
It must have. I don't know from firsthand or from immediate memory of anything in particular, but there's no doubt, I think, that it had to have done. They knew that we won the war for them, World War I, that is. If the Americans had not come into that war, it either would have gone on for a lot longer, or the Germans could very well have won. It was the Americans that turned that tide. So, the thing is, too, that it's often been said that the saved are often resentful of the savior. People don't like to be saved. They like to, they're happy to be saved, but they don't like to be in that position. And I think the British had some of that too.
I completely agree with that. The idea that, what do they call us? Brother Jonathan?
Yeah.
Brother Jonathan had to come across and save us.
Right.
So the Casablanca Conference happens in early 1943. We're talking with historian and author James Conroy about his book that's just out, The Devils Will Get No Rest, FDR, Churchill, and the Plan That Won the War. Before we talk about some of the issues, the personalities are always a lot of fun in any books like this when everyone gets together. To me, it was the one thing that struck was kind of how he appeared to be having just so much fun being the host, and that's General Patton.
Mm-hmm.
He pops out in your book quite a bit. What was his role? And he seems a kinder, gentler general than perhaps later in the war.
Well, Patton had been in command of the American invasion force that took North Africa in the fall of 42, which was why he was present, at all. And the Casablanca in Morocco was within his responsibility zone. So he was charged with the preparations and the logistics and the lodging and the food and all of that. I think I say in the book that he was cast in the unlikely role of cruise director.
Yeah, that's right.
And we all know what Patton was like. But he was not actually a conferee. He did not sit at the conference table. But he sat at the dining table every night with the British and the Americans, and played a role of kind of, bringing them together. And they all got a kick out of him. He's quite the character. At one point, he writes home that there's a conference going on here, and it's all very hush-hush, and I'm not involved in it. Thank God. I just want to go out and kill somebody.
The whole notion, you talk about the invasion of South Africa, I think that's November of 42.
North Africa, yeah. In 42, yeah.
And our friend P.E. McAllister, an Indianapolis business titan, was in that invasion. He passed a few years ago at the age of 102, but he was there. The whole notion of being in North Africa, is it fair to say that was somewhat controversial or a point of contention? In other words, the Americans wanted to invade Western Europe as soon as possible, and the British were like, you are not even close to being ready to take on the German army.
Right. Exactly that. In the preliminary conferences that preceded Casablanca, the Americans wanted to cross the channel as quickly as possible, kind of in the Ulysses S. Grant mode, hit them where they are and hit them hard until they stop struggling. And they were just cocky Americans who thought they could pull that off. And the Brits had crossed the channel before and didn't
Twice.
do well.
There and back.
Right. And including Lieutenant General Sir Alan Brooke, who's I think, kind of the star of the book, actually. He's not a household name, not only here, but even in Britain. But he was the chief of the Imperial General Staff of the British Army, the chief of staff, essentially, of the British Army. And he had been the principal advocate for a Mediterranean strategy to nibble around the edges of the Germans and weaken them and open the Mediterranean to maritime traffic. And then over time, build strength and diminish German capabilities until the time was right to cross the channel and attack them, which is the strategy that was eventually adopted. And I'm convinced that it would have been a catastrophe had they done what the Americans wanted to do. They just weren't ready for it.
And Brooke's diaries are just a gold mine for
they are great
historians, and he certainly doesn't hold anything back, to say the least.
No, he's a fascinating character. His surreptitious nickname among his subordinates was Colonel Shrapnel. He was just a very aggressive, very difficult character, demanding, very tough taskmaster, but also an artist, a wildlife photographer, an ornithologist. Wrote his mother these beautifully illustrated letters. He was a complicated guy and a very interesting guy. And I don't know, but for him, if the war would have been won. Montgomery actually called him the greatest soldier, sailor, or airman that either side produced in World War II. And he's really an unsung hero.
Let's hope Fleet Admiral Ernest King wasn't within earshot. That American might have lost his top, as he often did. Is it fair to say this is the conference where the leadership, if not in full bloom, but in its embryonic stage, the leadership of Dwight Eisenhower comes into view? He had a rough briefing, and if I recall from your book, he didn't perform very well in front of the group. Then he got another chance. How would you rate Eisenhower's performance at the conference, and how important was the conference for the emergence of Eisenhower to eventually become Supreme Allied Commander?
Well, I guess what comes to mind is that I would rate him at the conference the way he rated himself, which was not good.
Yeah,
he was relatively inexperienced. He had never been in combat himself. In World War I, he tried to go into it, but never got that opportunity. And as Supreme Commander of the European theater, the Brits again kind of said, a nice guy from Kansas. We like him. He's got a nice smile. And no one did more than Eisenhower to bring the British and the Americans together. Mm-hmm. He mingled them on his staff. He treated them identically. He didn't tolerate the slightest hint of Anglo-American nastiness.
Yeah, didn't he? Forgive me, but you say that nastiness, and I apologize for interrupting, but didn't he send someone home to the United States from Britain because one of his generals called a British general a British son of a bitch? And Eisenhower said, if you just called him a son of a bitch, everything would have been fine. But you called him a British one, and now you got to go.
Yeah, that's essentially correct. He said that in general. He said that any officer that he heard referring to a British son of a bitch would be gone the next day. Because if you think he's a son of a bitch, you're entitled to your opinion, but not a British son of a bitch.
I love that. It's just so classic Eisenhower.
Right. But all of that said, that he did not perform well at the conference. He had planned an attack on what was left of the German resistance in North Africa and Tunisia. And it was frankly just an amateur plan that overlooked a lot of very basic logistical problems. And Brooke just took him apart, at the conference table. Marshall was furious at him. He was a Marshall protege, Eisenhower was.
Mm-hmm.
But he was a great manager. And even then, he was very political. He had instincts about how to deal with people, how to bring people together and make things happen on a political level. But at that point, he was no military strategist. I'm not sure he ever was really a military strategist.
Brooke never thought he was. Brooke always
right.
denigrated his strategic mind, which I guess Eisenhower got the last laugh since he beat out Brooke to be in charge of the invasion in 1944.
Correct.
Other personalities there, Charles de Gaulle.
Yeah.
I can't get a read on how much he's actually hated by folks in history.
Mm-hmm.
Appears to be considerable, yet his presence was necessary at the conference, do you think? And how did he eventually outlast his detractors to become basically the head of the French?
Well, first of all, before I forget it, Churchill used to call him Joan of Arc.
And not a compliment.
No, that he had a stupendous ego, de Gaulle. These are all guys with big egos, as you can imagine. But de Gaulle was, I think, 6'5" and had a 6'5" ego to go with it, and just impossible to deal with. Incredibly narcissistic, difficult guy. But on the other hand, he was the symbol in France of resistance. He was a relatively young general when the Germans rolled over the French. He was one of the very few commanders in that conflict that actually scored some successes and performed very well. And at the end of it, when the French capitulated and basically agreed to be subservient to the Germans in the Vichy government, de Gaulle got on a plane, very small plane, and had himself flown to London in a very cinematic fashion. Went over with Churchill's blessing, and basically Churchill backed him as the leader of what was called the Free French, relatively small contingent of exiles and men that had been evacuated at Dunkirk and a few isolated warships and such. Not a formidable force, but it was fighting France. It was like the spirit of resistance, and got on the BBC. Frequently broadcast to his compatriots, and that was an essential element of keeping France in a position to resist. So he really was kind of an indispensable character.
The last name I'll throw out there is Winston Churchill. Clearly, the British had significantly deeper interests in the Mediterranean Sea and that area than the United States did. Why do you rate Churchill as, I don't want to make this question overly broad, how do you rate Churchill as someone trying to balance the preservation of the empire with winning the war and doing so without making the Americans angry?
Yeah, well, Churchill is the indispensable player, I think, in World War II. Everybody knows Churchill and what a tremendous leader he was and what a inspiring figure he was and all of that, particularly in the darkest days in 1940 when the British were really on the ropes. And I have no doubt at all that Churchill's first, second, and third priority was to win the war. He knew that they had to win the war. I mean, if they hadn't, there would be no empire and there would be no British history. I mean, it literally would have ended British history as an independent country. So that was definitely first and foremost. But that said, he was also an arch imperialist and was always conscious of how things affected the empire and how, the importance of keeping the empire together, both during the war and post-war. Always looking ahead to what happens next after we win this war. So, the interesting contrast, or one of many interesting contrasts in this whole story, is FDR, the very liberal anti-imperialist, with this partnership with the very conservative arch-imperialist Winston Churchill. At one point, Churchill wrote to FDR and said something to the effect he was glad to be in the same century with you, which I thought is a great line. They recognized each other as monumental historic figures, both indispensable to the war, and were definitely friends and mutually admired one another. But there was also tension there and rivalry. And after Casablanca, it actually deteriorated quite a bit. When FDR started cozying up to Stalin more than Churchill, but that's another story.
Stalin is not present at the Casablanca Conference because he is dealing with Stalingrad, as you mentioned, and 100 other battles across the Soviet Union. But his presence is there. And is the specter of Stalin hanging over the conference with regard to Allied priorities? Specifically, he was beating the hell out of Churchill because England wouldn't invade France and he was desperate for a second front. So even though Churchill was there, Stalin wasn't there. How did Stalin's needs, personality, disposition influence what happened at the conference?
Well, I'll put it this way. To start from the other end of it, the British and the Americans were painfully aware that the survival of the Soviet Union and its hanging on as a fighting force was crucial to the outcome of the war. If the largest part of the British, or rather of the German war machine, was thrown against the Russians, not against Western Europe. And had they defeated the Russians and driven Stalin out of power and basically knocked Russia out of the war, the best the Americans and the British could have hoped for, and they were well aware of it, was a stalemate. They could simply not have won the war without the Russians. And so a big part of the conference, even in the absence of Stalin, floated around the idea, what do we need to do to relieve pressure on the Russians, and what's the best way to do that? I don't know that it was Stalin's personality as much as that geopolitical sort of fact that was dominant. But, Churchill and Brooke had met with Stalin. I can't remember exactly how many months it was before the conference, but in recent memory. And it had not been a pleasant encounter. Stalin was putting great pressure on the British and the Americans to do exactly what the Americans wanted to do, which was to invade France and thereby draw a lot of German power west and away from him. It's often said, really, that the Russians won the war and the Anglo-Americans helped.
Especially with Operation Bagration that happens in 1944 in concert with the D-Day landings. It just has to be tough for a historian, let alone just a history buff like me, to give Stalin the credit that he perhaps deserves, given that he's probably the second greatest killer of all time.
Yeah, or he's up there, certainly. Yeah. Very evil man and totally ruthless and, as bad as it gets as far as morals and worldview. But Churchill said, actually, Churchill's got so many great lines, but at one point when the Russians did invade, or rather when the Germans did invade Russia, Churchill had been the most anti-communist figure, I think, in the Western world. And he said at a secret session of Parliament that if the Germans invaded hell, he would find something good to say about Satan. So, so he was perfectly fine with cozying up with Stalin.
You're listening to Leaders and Legends, a podcast presented by Veteran Strategies, an Indiana-based public relations enterprise, and sponsored by Garmong Construction, Leaders and Legends LLC, the Grand Hall and Conference Center at Historic Union Station, the McGinley's Golden Ace Inn, and NFP a national insurance broker with strong local content. Our guest today is historian and author James Conroy. We are discussing his book, The Devils Will Get No Rest, FDR, Churchill, and the Plan That Won the War. We've talked a little bit about personalities. Let's talk issues for the last half of the podcast. What did they come there to decide? And did they accomplish the goals set for the conference?
Well, there were essentially two dominant issues at the conference and probably half a dozen lesser, although important issues. But the two dominant issues were how much of our resources and effort are we going to put into the war against Japan, and how much are we going to put into the war against Germany and Italy? And the second was whether or not they would cross the Channel as quickly as possible or work their way up through the Mediterranean, as I said earlier, and wear the Germans down, open the Mediterranean to maritime traffic, which was crucial to the Brits. And those were the two dominant issues. And I forgot the second part of your question.
The second question is, did they basically accomplish, because I want to get back to the Pacific theater as it relates to planning and logistics and your friend, Admiral King. Mm-hmm. But would they have called it, and do you consider it a successful summit, a successful discussion?
Definitely. I think it was crucial to if not to the outcome of the war, certainly to the duration of the war and the ultimate success of it. To come to the bottom line, the decision was made that they would pursue the Mediterranean strategy rather than cross the Channel as quickly as possible. And on the other big issue, they essentially agreed that, and they always had really, that Germany had to be defeated first because it was by far the more powerful and more dangerous adversary. And after Midway and Coral Sea, it was pretty clear that eventually they would defeat Japan. It was going to be a long, hard slog, very costly in lives and resources. But Churchill actually said that once the Germans were defeated, then defeating Japan would just be a matter of time. So they basically agreed with that common principle. But Admiral King, in particular, being the naval guy, and it was a naval war, would really rather have gone full bore against Japan and let the British, hold the Germans until Japan was defeated, sort of the opposite of what the Brits wanted. But he subsumed that, that personal goal to the greater good and really understood that Germany really had to go first for those reasons.
It became a latent, or perhaps at times not so latent, threat where Marshall or Admiral Leahy, who was Roosevelt's chief of staff, or Admiral King or whomever would say, the hell with this. We're going to go to the Pacific. That they didn't threaten the Brits with that, but they hinted we can do what we want. And if we want to go turn our eyes wholly to the Pacific or mostly, we'll do it. Is that a fair way to put it, that implied option / threat was there?
Oh yeah. In fact, I would go a step further and say that they did explicitly threaten that at a couple of points in the conference. Marshall later admitted he was bluffing about that. There was just no way they could do that. If you look at the map of Europe and the map of the South Pacific, they had already checked the Japanese ability to wage offensive war by Midway in the Coral Sea, and they were building their power and using it very well indeed. And they knew they were going to beat Japan eventually, but nobody was sure about the European war at that point. The war could have gone either way at that time. In fact, at one point in the middle of the conference, Brooks said very simply and pointedly, if we try to defeat Japan first, we shall lose the war. And that's pretty stark. And I think he believed it.
Not to come off as a completely ridiculous American homer, but I was in the Army, so let's ask this one question. And I asked it of Craig Simons, if you've heard of Craig, the naval historian.
Yeah.
Britain hung on. It did everything it needed to do it could do all of its natural gifts to lead to victory. What the Soviets did is almost incomprehensible, in the tens of millions of deaths. On top of the fact that Stalin had already killed tens of millions of his own people in previous decades. But the performance of the United States in the war to basically fight two unprecedented wars at the same time, thousands of miles, not only from the United States, but from each other.
Mm-hmm.
I just can't think of any parallel in history to the performance of the United States in World War II. If there is one, please tell me.
No, I think that's fair. It's a stupendous achievement, really. And what we lack today in this country is anything like the unity and determination and collective effort that it took to do that. The war production alone boggles the mind. I'm not good with numbers, and I can't recite the numbers for you, but the sheer numbers of aircraft and ships and small arms and tanks, it just boggles the mind that the entire industrial capacity almost of the United States went into that war for 4 years, and without it, there's just no doubt of what the outcome would have been. Not to mention I think the number is somewhere over 300,000 dead that we suffered in that war.
I think it's
which is
400,000 and some. Yeah, I think that's okay. Right.
Somewhere in that ballpark. Which, as you say, is any one death is catastrophic for that person, but it was dwarfed by the Russian casualties and the German casualties and the Japanese casualties. It's just an incredible achievement, really.
One of my favorite quotes about the United States is, there's several, and a lot of them come from Europe, whether it's Bismarck saying, God protects fools, drunks in the United States.
Right.
Or he says, yeah, I think that's it. Or
that's right. Yeah, I think so.
And the other one is British Foreign Secretary Grey, Edward Grey, referred to the United States as, quote, a gigantic boiler. There's no limit to the heat it can produce when lit.
Yeah. Yeah.
Did the Germans or the Japanese ever get that sense? Like what have we, the awakened giant is obviously the metaphor, but does this start to come through at Casablanca? The United States' war production's up. The draft is going on. The troops are starting to be deployed and fighting, specifically in Europe. They were already in the Pacific. They've got, the United States has all this money, all this production. We're basically producing almost everything that's needed, especially like trucks and stuff like that for Stalin, which he couldn't get enough of. Mm-hmm. Did that lead to a change in the hierarchy among the Allies? And was it fueled by the Casablanca Conference, where everyone got together and the Brits realized this is starting to become the Americans' war? Yes,
absolutely. The up until this point, about the time of the Casablanca Conference, well, put it this way: at the time of the Casablanca Conference, not a single American soldier had fired a shot in Europe. And not a single American bomb had fallen on Germany. This was completely the British war up to that point, other than what you just said, the industrial production and the weapons production and the rest. The Americans had really quite recently begun to bomb military targets in France and Holland, but they had not yet dropped a bomb on Germany. So it was really a British war and a Russian war, I should say, until about this time. And everybody could see that was about to shift, that the Americans were going to get into this war big time in Europe. And everybody knew the weakness of the British resources and industrial capacity and all the rest compared to the Americans. So they knew that was coming. It was already beginning to happen. And as time went on, increasingly, it became an American war predominantly in Europe, and the Brits were well aware of it. And they could also see beyond the horizon that after the war, they were going to be a hollow shell of what they had been, and the Americans were going to be the dominant power in the West.
Is it fair to say the biggest policy statement that emanates from the Casablanca Conference is what's known as the Casablanca Declaration? You mentioned our friend, Mr. Grant, about 30 minutes ago. What was the Casablanca Declaration, and why did or was the demand for unconditional surrender of the Axis powers so important?
Well, it's a very interesting story, actually, and I spent a good bit of time on it in the book. Churchill had discussed with FDR the possibility, and in both of their opinions, the beneficial effect of making a statement that there would be no outcome in this war other than the unconditional surrender of the Axis powers. That was unprecedented in American history. Every other war we had fought had, one way or another, ended up in a kind of a negotiated resolution, one way or another. But the driving force behind that was, there's no way we're going to leave a Nazi government in charge of Germany after this war is over. And there's no way we're going to leave, the imperial warlords in charge of Japan after this war is over, because we'll just come back and do this again in 3 or 4 or 5 years.
In World War I, when the Germans signed the armistice, there were no Allied, correct me if I'm wrong, there was not a single Allied soldier in World War I on German territory when the war ended. So they never had that experience.
That's correct. And so Churchill and FDR had agreed, really. In fact, Churchill had gotten his cabinet, sent a cable from Casablanca to his cabinet, getting their approval of this policy. But what happened was, at the end of the conference, there was after they were all done and were about to leave, they had a military press conference. They called in all the war correspondents in North Africa to Casablanca. They didn't know why they were going there. They didn't know that Churchill and FDR were there. And they showed up at the site of the conference, and out walks Churchill and FDR and de Gaulle and another important French general, and they were all shocked. And FDR at that conference made this announcement that there would be no outcome but the unconditional surrender of the Axis powers. Churchill's head literally snapped around when FDR said that, because he had not been expecting it to be announced at that point. And there's some confusion, or I guess lack of knowledge, really, about what their intention was as to when they would make that announcement. But FDR just sort of said it and caught Churchill by surprise. And Churchill had no choice but to rally behind that and endorse it. There was a lot of controversy at the time and ever since about whether that was a good idea or not. The major reason to do it was what I said about, certainly we couldn't leave these evil regimes in power. But on the other hand, there was a thought, well, they're going to fight all the harder if they think there's no other outcome but their total destruction and defeat, number one. And number two, we're going to undermine the possibility of a coup, either in Tokyo or in Berlin. And as I'm sure you know, there was in fact a conspiracy among some of the German senior leadership to kill Hitler, and they tried. The thought was that that would save a lot of blood and time and effort if that were to happen. But if we say no, you all have to give up your arms and lay on the ground and do whatever we feel like doing with you, there was a lot of controversy about whether that was a good thing or a bad thing.
In your mind, did it mean more that those words were spoken, announced by Roosevelt, as opposed to having them announced by Churchill?
I don't think so, because Churchill, again, had no choice once he heard those words, being said at a press conference, to immediately agree and say, yeah, we're both on the same page on this. There was really had no practical alternative. So, they both rallied behind that policy at that point.
We have a few more minutes with author and historian James Conroy. We are discussing his book, The Devils Will Get No Rest, FDR, Churchill, and the Plan That Won the War. We've talked a few minutes ago about how the United States was kind of in the ascendant, for lack of a better term, as it relates to the end of the war from Casablanca on. Are you surprised at how quickly, assuming that 2 years is quick, the war ended after Casablanca? There was the Tehran conference, there was the Yalta conference, there were others. But to me, after reading your book, and I confess I didn't know anything about the Casablanca conference other than the unconditional surrender declaration, that the path to the defeat of the Axis was laid here, the foundation at Casablanca.
Yes, that's correct. And there were adjustments, as you would expect there would have to be as the war went on. The head of the RAF, Charles Portal, not a well-known figure, but a brilliant guy, and the Americans thought very highly of him. He made that point very clear in the conference, and that nobody can project what you're going to have to do a year from now in a war. There's just too many variables and too many things that are unpredictable. And so adjustments were made. But this was basically the blueprint that was followed throughout the rest of the war and effectively won the war, as the title says.
Ask you a quick question about Sicily. As you said, the invasion of Europe, the cross-channel invasion, was pushed off. Do you agree with the decision to invade Sicily and then Italy, just in terms of in the general outlook of the war and how it ended?
Well, smarter and more depthy experts than I differ on that point. But I think the weight of opinion is that the right decision was made in taking Sicily, because if you just look at the map, you can see how it's right in the smack in the middle of the Mediterranean, and it made it possible for them to open the Mediterranean, and also made a great jumping off point, into Italy and otherwise. I think the weight of opinion is that it was wise to take Sicily and wise to begin fighting up the Italian boot, but they probably spent too much time in Italy after that. There were tremendous casualties and heavily fortified and mountain ranges and very tough German resistance. And I guess the weight of opinion is that they shouldn't have fought their way all the way up the boot as they did. That it would have been better to stop at Rome.
If you were a soldier back then for any country, Mr. Conroy, which front would you have said, no, I don't want to go there? In other words, some places were worse than others.
Yeah, I think the Russian front takes that prize. That was a brutal thing. And I don't know of anywhere else. Well, I mean, it was all horrible, certainly. But I think the Russian front would be the last place on your list if you had to choose where you wanted to be a soldier in the trenches.
We have reached the point in the Leaders and Legends podcast where we ask the same 5 questions of all of our guests. James Conroy, are you ready?
I am.
What was your first job?
16 years old, taking shopping carts out of the parking lot in the supermarket, stocking the shelves, bagging the groceries.
That's a good first job.
Yeah.
Number 2, what was your first concert?
I as best I can reconstruct it, I think I was probably a senior in high school. I lived in Stratford, Connecticut, which was the home of a Shakespeare theater for obvious reasons. And there were concerts held there. And this was at the height of the folk music phase. And I think the first concert I saw was Pete Seeger, one of the founding fathers of the folk music movement.
I think that's a first. We've asked this question of a couple hundred people. I don't think I've heard Pete Seeger first. Yeah. Makes sense, though. Number 3, if you could suggest any book for someone to read, which book would you recommend?
Fiction or nonfiction? Any book at all?
You can have one of each, since you're giving us so much of your time.
Okay. Well, on the fiction end, I would say 1984. I think that's a terrific book, George Orwell's 1984, not only for its message, but also for its evoking a very weird environment. So that would be my top. Fiction, I guess my favorite is Rick Atkinson's trilogy on World War II. I think that's a terrific piece of work.
We've heard that more than once, that the Atkinson's books are just terrific.
Yeah,
I need to have him on the podcast since his name keeps coming up. I've read one of his books, but I can't remember. But he clearly has got the respect of his peers.
Yep.
Number 4, if you could witness any event in history, be there in person as it happens, which event would you choose?
Can I get 2 of those too?
We're easy here. We're fun people.
One is entirely personal. I would love to see a videotape of my first date with my wife. That's number 1.
Where'd you take her?
Well, we were in college at the time, and we just kind of hung out at the student union. But I would love to see a videotape of that. But for historical events, I am not a specifically religious person, but I think I'd have to say the Sermon on the Mount. I would really like to see what that phenomenon was like.
And we have had that answer several times.
Have you? Yeah.
Last question. If you could have dinner with anyone living today, 2 hours off the record just to chat, whom would you choose?
That's an easy one. Paul McCartney. I think
that's a popular answer. Yes, agreed.
Yeah. I think he's the greatest living artist, and just a fascinating guy, and also a very good guy from what I can tell. And I would love to do that with him.
Fair to say he's the most famous person in the world, maybe along with the Pope and Charles III.
Yeah, I would say he's certainly got to be one of the top 3 or 4.
Have a favorite Beatles song?
Oh, too many. But if I had to pick one, it would be Penny Lane, I guess.
And that's off Magical Mystery Tour, isn't it?
No, I don't think it ever was on an album. I think it was just a single. I don't think it ever was on an album, except the compilation albums.
I'll have to look. To me, Magical Mystery Tour, that's my favorite Beatles album.
Yeah.
And I read mostly because I Am the Walrus is my favorite song, but I read an article that stated that Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band not only isn't Club Band is not only not the Beatles' best album, it's not the Beatles' best album of 1967, which is mind-boggling when you consider it.
They're in a class up by themselves.
You have been listening to Leaders and Legends, a podcast presented by Veteran Strategies, an Indiana-based public relations enterprise, and sponsored by Garmong Construction, Leaders and Legends LLC, the Grand Hall and Conference Center at Historic Union Station, the McGinley's Golden Ace Inn, and NFP, a national insurance broker with strong local content. Our guest today has been James Conroy, author of several terrific books. I've read 3 of them now, so I need to tackle the 4th and whatever else you're going to have come out. The book is called The Devils Will Get No Rest, FDR, Churchill, and the Plan That Won the War. It's a terrific account. Tells you about a whole bunch of things that you probably don't either know or didn't consider about the crucial aspect of this meeting. Thank you so much, James, for coming on the podcast and for writing your books. They're wonderful.
Thank you so much, Robert. It's been a real pleasure.
Thank you very much for listening to Leaders and Legends, brought to you by Veteran Strategies Incorporated. If you want to contact us about this program or our menu of public relations services, please send us an email at robert@veteranstrategies.com. That's robert@veteranstrategies.com.
This podcast was produced and edited by Chris Spangle and Leaders and Legends, LLC. If you're interested in starting a podcast or taking yours to the next level, please contact us at leadersandlegends.net.